You're listening to Bible Truth Feed, a podcast by christadelphianvideo.org for Christadelphians and all those seeking the truth about the Bible message. Join us now as we present our latest episode.
And I don't know if there's a bigger question that we need to ask. Is there a God or isn't there? Because there are significant consequences, not only for your future, but right now, based on how you answer that question. Is there a God or isn't there? And that's a bit of a provocative title, isn't it? Atheism or a creator, which requires more faith. It makes it sound almost like it's a contest. Who has more faith? Or maybe a lot of faith isn't a good thing. So, and I read a little bit of the discussion online, and I think that the question of what do we mean by faith is an important one to discuss first. What do we mean by faith? So the way we're taking this, and what we mean by this is faith is a strong confidence in someone or something. A strong confidence in someone or something. So think of it this way. All of our homes are built on a foundation. And you have faith in that foundation that it's going to hold up your home. But if you decide to investigate that foundation, and you start to really look into it, like, what is my faith based on? I've never been in the basement. I've never looked at the walls. I've never investigated it. What would happen if you started seeing some cracks in the foundation and maybe some water leaking in? Or maybe some of the doors in your house don't quite open and close the way they used to. It might shake your faith, your confidence in that, and you may have to investigate. And what we intend to do this afternoon, it's not set up as a debate. This is more of an inquiry, an investigation. And we intend to give atheism, that foundation of atheism, a little inspection. We're going to have a look at it. And we're going to see if it is as doubt-free as modern media would like you to believe it is. So perhaps a clearer title of what we're trying to get at this afternoon is Atheism or a Creator. Where should you place your faith? Right? Where should you place your faith? And another note, faith is not a bad thing. Okay, we place faith in everything. We place faith in other drivers when we're driving here and when we're going to drive home. We place faith in our colleagues. We place faith in this computer right now that it will maintain itself throughout this talk. In the Bible, it says this. It says, without faith, it is impossible to please God. Okay, so faith is not a bad thing. It's cherished in our Creator's sight. But when dealing with your life, you want to be very, very careful of what you're putting your faith in. And so today, what we're going to do is we're going to look at science. We're going to ask science, the compass of science, if you will, to help us investigate this question: is there a God or isn't there? And this is just science. We could very easily, and maybe this is something the Collingwood Christadelphians want to do. What does history point to? Does history point towards a God or no God? Does archaeology? Does philosophy? You could look at art, the beauty in this world, and ask, does it point towards a creator or no? Oxford mathematician John Lennox, he gave this example just to bring across this idea. He called it Aunt Matilda's cake. So picture somebody makes a cake, Aunt Matilda, and you could go to science, and science could tell you, you could go to a chemist and they could tell you about the reaction. And as it started to heat up, they could tell you about the reactions. A biochemist could tell you about the fats and the proteins in the cake. A physicist might tell you about the fundamental chemicals and particles in that cake. And mathematicians could tell you about the density and the volume. But if you were to ask all those people, why was the cake made? Science would be silent. They couldn't answer that question. They'd have to go outside science. And it's an equally important question. Why is this world the way it is? Not just what's in it and all the particles. Why is it here? Nobel laureate Erwin Schrödinger. You may have heard of Schrödinger's cat experiment. He was one of the beginning minds on quantum mechanics. He said, science cannot tell us a word about beautiful and ugly, good or bad, God and eternity, although they sometimes pretend to answer these questions. So that's just one point. Yes, we're going to look at science, but that's not the whole story. The other point I want to make out very clearly is, I am not a scientist. I am not in the labs. I'm not writing or reading the papers that are being developed right now. I'm a school teacher. But I think I think I bring a unique perspective to this. My whole job is to make things simple, to get it down to its basics so kids will understand. So that's one thing that you're going to notice about this. I'm going to try to get it down to the very basics and ask some very simple questions. But we're all fortunate that the leading scientists, the leading thinkers on both sides, atheistic side and the creationist side, love to debate these topics. And they have written books on these topics. And we can read and we can listen and we can meditate and think about these things. And so just one example, there's a podcast called Unbelievable, where they get a leading atheist scientist and a leading creationist scientist, and they have them debate their best arguments. And you know what? There's no slam dunk argument. The Christian believers are still Christian believers at the end, and quite often the atheist believers are still atheists at the end. So you have to conclude, Christian scientists must have very strong arguments that, the world would like you to think, the media would like you to think, oh, it's a slam dunk. Not so, especially not so when you listen to these debates. So it's some of those arguments that we're going to look at tonight or this afternoon. So let's clarify the two positions. And there can only be one or the other. You can't have sort of halfway here. And it's a very simple question, something we could have, 10-year-olds in here, and we could ask this question. Either there is intelligence and purpose behind everything, the workings of a God, or there isn't. And this is what is called atheism. Sometimes it's called naturalism. There's different words for it. But atheism has asserted that the universe, the world, everything in it came about by a random, mindless, unguided process. And the word process, there could be argument about that word. Accident might be something more appropriate. But keep those thoughts in mind. Either it is from an intelligent mind, or it is a random, mindless, unguided process. And that's what the atheists would say. Those are the words they would use to describe their belief. And so here's our journey for today. We're going to look at neo-Darwinism. It's something that I think we have to touch on. We'll put it to some scrutiny, and see if it can bear the expectations that are placed upon it. Second, we're going to talk about the rational intelligibility of the world. We're going to look at the very fact that the world, the universe, is intelligible. We can look at it and understand it. What does that lead us to conclude? We'll look at the fine-tuning of the universe. It's a well-known argument. And finally, we'll look at information-rich biology. So that's our journey for today. So let's get into it. Neo-Darwinism. So in 1859, you all know, Darwin wrote on the origin of the species. And in a nutshell, he claims that natural selection is the creative force behind all species on the planet. So it gave atheists their how. Okay, I don't believe in a God. Well, how did all this come about? Natural selection. We've got it now. Okay. And since 1859, It has become, I would say, a sacrosanct theory beyond scrutiny. Okay? Scientists like Richard Dawkins, who you'll hear quite a bit this afternoon, he calls people who don't believe in Darwinism ignorant, stupid, and insane. Nobel laureate Christian de Duve said, "You must not question evolution," which doesn't sound like a very scientific statement. Daniel Dennett, he's an American philosopher, he said, "People who don't believe in evolution and Darwinism are inexcusably ignorant." So there's a meanness, there's a nastiness that arises. In the late 1990s, there was a paleontologist from China, Wan Chen, who came over, and he had some discoveries with paleontology, the artifacts he was finding, and they questioned popular Darwin theories. And he presented them in the US. And he was met with a lot of criticism, a lot of silence. People didn't like what he was saying. And so he said, in China, you can criticize Darwin, but not the government. Mm-hmm. In the US, you can criticize the government, but not Darwin. And we have to ask, why is that? Why won't scientists let science question one of their scientific theories? And I think it's very clear. I think Darwin, his evolutionary theory has become a faith-based religion, to be quite honest. And I'm not the only one who thought that. Michael Ruse, who's a philosopher, he said, for many people, evolution has played the role of secular religion. So they even have, sort of counterposed to Christmas Day, they have Darwin Day, where they'll give presents to one another and things like that. Karl Popper, a scientific philosopher, he said, "A scientific theory may become an intellectual fashion, a substitute for religion, and entrenched in dogma," adding, "This is certainly true of evolutionary theory." But just keep in mind, this theory came about in 1859. So if someone were to ask me, "John, do you believe in evolution?" I would probably say, "Well, what do you mean?" Because there's different meanings for evolution. So let's just quickly go through these. First, change or development. So we may talk about the evolution of a car, from the early 1900s to the early 2000s. Yeah, there's been an evolution in the car. You can see the changes, or an evolution in a river, and you can see how the river has changed. So yes, I would agree with evolution in that sense. Things do change, either by human interaction or by some natural forces. Microevolution. Yeah, I believe in microevolution. I think it's hard to deny. We have a variety of different types of people in here. Clearly, we're not all the same. COVID, the virus COVID is an example that it's modified itself a little bit, but it's still a virus, right? It hasn't changed into something else. It's still a virus. So there's these micro changes that I would agree with within a set limits of a complexity. It's not becoming more complex. Artificial selection is another word term that might come up when you hear about evolution. And this is the idea that sometimes farmers will start playing with plants and animals. And, these breeders will bring about changes. And you think about grapes. I remember when I was a kid and you'd eat a grape, there were seeds in it and the skin was thick. And nowadays you can get grapes and there doesn't seem to be any seeds in it, and they're huge and the skin is thin. And Darwin thought, well, if humans can do that to animals and plants over a short period of time, natural selection can do that over a huge period of time. But animal plant breeders or human breeders of plants and animals, they're putting foresight and intellectual input into those things. Natural selection is mindless. And so I don't think that's a fair comparison. Common descent is another idea. So that's the idea that everything came from one common ancestor. And so there might be some truth in that humans all have the same common ancestor, and perhaps dogs all have a common ancestor. But to say that the variety of life that we see all came from one bacteria millions, billions of years ago, no, we would not agree with that. There's no mechanism for such modifications. Molecular evolution, this is attempts to suggest that evolution has something to do with the way non-living things became living. And, there's been no success in showing that that's possible. And then, of course, the last is macro evolution, large-scale innovation, the development of new organs, new structures, new body plans, new genetic material, which would require massive increases in qualitative complexity. And it doesn't matter how much time you throw at something, you will not get macroevolution. Okay, so just a bit of a clarification on what we're talking about. So if somebody said, you don't believe in evolution, well, it depends on what one you're talking about, what definition. But here are some of the big problems with macroevolution, which is the popular one that people are thinking about when they talk about evolution. The first is, there's a couple that I had on here, but I've taken out just for time's sake. Fossil records do not promote macroevolution. Time constraints, they're finding there's just not enough time based on how long we think the universe has been here for the millions and millions of small changes that would have to take place. But here are three of the big problems with macroevolution. The first one is just natural selection in itself. This is the backbone of Darwin's theory, and it can't bear the burden that's been placed upon it. Scientists are recognizing more and more, and they're desperate to find a new theory in its place. So the two main problems with natural selection are, number one, it takes material that is already there and it weeds things out. It is not creative in any sense. Okay, so that's a huge problem with natural selection. It does not create. It takes what's there and it might modify in micro ways. So if you're going from the most simplest form of life, which they say from the simplest bacteria to ourselves, that would take extreme increases in functioning complex genetic material. And natural selection is not creative. One scientist said it's more likely to break something than to create something. So if it's going to do anything, the other part is you need life to exist already if natural selection is going to do anything. So convinced Darwinists, consider this quote, it's from convinced Darwinists, John Maynard Smith and E. Zathmary. They said there is no theoretical reason that would permit us to expect that evolutionary lines would increase in complexity with time. There is no empirical evidence that this happens. Okay, so it just doesn't work. In fact, some people point to bacteria. So you have 150 years of studying bacteria, and one generation is made every 30 minutes. So you have millions and millions of generations study, and bacteria is still bacteria. It hasn't increased in its genetic material. So the second problem is foresight. So foresight is the ability to predict what will happen or what will be needed in the future. Foresight requires a mind. So this is a very popular idea from chemist Marcus Eberlein out of Brazil. He's a world-renowned chemist. And he gives the example of Henry Ford. And he's designed a car that's going to move people at good, pretty good speeds. In his foresight, he said, okay, this mechanism is going to come up to obstacles and it needs a steering wheel. Okay, so he put in a steering wheel mechanism. And he also had the foresight to say, okay, we're going to have to be able to stop this thing as well. So he put in brakes. So that's an example of foresight. It takes a mind, it takes engineering. Well, biologists see this idea of foresight all the time. Every creature has some degree of purposeful design, things that will help it solve problems that it could not have had the foresight to know about. Dawkins himself says, biology is the study of complicated things that have the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. Let me give you one example of foresight. So I know growing up, if somebody got appendicitis, what would they do? They'd go in and they'd cut it out. But I've known a number of people over the last 5-6 years who have had appendicitis and they won't cut it out unless it's like ready to burst. They'll treat you with antibiotics. And like, what? Why the change? Why are they reluctant to take out the appendix now? Well, this is a sign of foresight. So we know that there's a problem in life. Sometimes we get something inside of us that's bad for us. And so with foresight, when we were created, we have this thing called diarrhea that cleanses out the system. It gets rid of the bacteria, the bad bacteria. The problem is it gets rid of the good bacteria as well. Well, what they're finding is the appendix is considered a safe house for good bacteria. And so it will replenish your colon with the bacteria you need, the good bacteria, which is why they are more reluctant to cut those out now. So it's a sign of foresight. And this Marcus Eberlein, he has a book filled with ingenious solutions to these problems. The last one we want to talk about, problem with neo-Darwinism, is this idea of irreducible complexity. It's the all or nothing. So there are things in nature that would not work unless it had everything. And even Darwin recognized this problem. And he said, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ could not have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, his theory would break down. Okay, so in other words, if the thing that we see in nature needed complexity at the beginning and wouldn't have worked without that complexity, then the theory of evolution, the natural selection would break down. And so there's a biochemist named Michael Behe who has many of these molecular machines that demonstrate this all or nothing, this irreducible complexity. And so here's just a popular example he's put forward. This is the flagellum on a bacteria. It's the little thing, the little tail that allows it to move. It's made up of 40 protein parts. It has a rotor, it has a stators, it has the bushings, a drive shaft. It can rotate. I read 18,000 RPM. I read somewhere else 100,000 RPM. And just look at it. This is on the left is more of a molecular look at it. On the right is what an engineer would see. It'd be like an engineer's diagram. Look at all the parts. And if any of those parts is missing, it won't work. And so why would something so small, and I forget the number, I think 35,000 of these would fit on the head of a pin. These are extremely small, and yet so complicated. Now, why would a bacteria, without foresight, without purpose, without a mind, develop, let's say, with only 38 proteins, and there's a couple parts missing, it doesn't work. Why would it continue to have slight modifications to develop something this complicated? It's all or nothing. It had to be there right from the beginning. Here's another one that's coming out more recently. It's called bacteriophage. Has anyone ever heard of these? A bacteriophage, really they're phages. they're a cross between a lunar lander, a cruise missile, and an EpiPen. So a phage can be described as a specific type of listen to these words. This is from Helen White and Elena Orlova, who wrote a book called Bacteriophage. Listen to the words they use. It's a type of nanomachine that is able to recognize its environment, find a host cell, start infection, self-assemble, and safeguard its genome until the next cycle of replication is initiated. Okay, so as we look at things with these more and more powerful microscopes, we're finding things don't get simpler as they get smaller. They seem to be getting more and more complicated. So what this virus does is it hunts out specific bacteria, like a cruise missile. When it finds one, it lands like a lunar lander. It pierces the cell and injects its DNA, which is in the top of it, into the bacteria. The bacteria then goes out and reproduces itself. It then sends out an enzyme which blows the cell up, allowing it to the duplicates to go out after more bacteria. This could be a solution to some of our problems with antibiotic resistance, because they're learning how to take these molecular machines and have them attack specific bacteria. So pretty amazing. Now, all this is leading to this. Some neo-Darwinist evolutionary faithful are saying, okay, we're getting into a problem here. We're learning more, and the more we're learning, the more this 1859 theory is breaking down. And so they're starting to have conferences. This one is called Potential and Limitations of Evolutionary Processes. And they're following on a pattern from one in November 2016 by the Royal Society in London, called New Trends in Evolutionary Biology. It says that it openly spoke of the need for a revision of the standard neo-Darwinian model of evolutionary theory. I like that they openly spoke of the need. There's this sense of tremendous fear of questioning the Darwinian theory among scientists. I sort of picture what Galileo must have been feeling when he was bringing about his heliocentric idea. And those who held the Aristotle view of the geocentric were quite upset with him. So let's get back to that initial question. Where should you place your faith? Is it more logical to believe that a world where living things are not only complex, but required the complexity at the very smallest scale and right from the beginning, in order to even function, came about by a creator with foresight, purpose, and intelligence, or by a random, mindless, unguided process? Okay, so let's move on to number 2, the rational intelligibility of our world. So what do we mean by that? So some of the greatest scientific discoveries are when mankind can articulate the laws that the universe operates under. So we have Newton, Einstein, humans that look at nature, they look at the world, they look at the universe, and they discover patterns, and they discover systems. And they discover laws that everything seems to run by. And so they express these as theorems, they express them as laws, they express them as principles. Here are some examples: the law of thermodynamics, the law of universal gravitation, Archimedes' principle, Bernoulli's principle, E equals mc squared. The question is, why? Why should we expect to find laws, principles, and systems in the universe? Okay. Einstein said the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible. Why can we understand all this? Why can we define these things? So what's a more logical conclusion? We have definable laws, principles, and systems because the world came about by a random, mindless, purposeless accident? Or we have definable laws, principles, and systems because it came about by an intelligent creator? So let me just ask this question. How long do you think literary scholars would investigate a book, let's say a book of poetry or a play written by an ape that randomly tapped away at a typewriter? I think it wouldn't take too long before they looked at the pages and they say, there's no pattern here. There's no logic to it. There's no meaning. And they would abandon that book. There's nothing to it. On the other hand, how long, to the chagrin of grade 9 and 10 students, at least in Ontario, have we been investigating creative books by William Shakespeare and poetry by Robert Frost? Well, why do we keep investigating? Why do we keep reading them? Why do we encourage other people to read them? It's because there's patterns. There's plot, there's character, there's emotion, there's themes. We keep reading them and enjoying them because there's a creative mind behind them. Well, how much more the universe? Perhaps the reason people keep investigating the universe is because there's a creative mind behind it that put together these laws and principles. If it was just a shambles, mindless, purposeless, I don't think we would continue to investigate it, or there wouldn't be anything to investigate. And so C.S. Lewis put it beautifully. He said, men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a legislator. Okay, now C.S. Lewis was an atheist who became a Christian, but you might say, well, that's a Christian's perspective. Well, here's Melvin Calvin. He's a Nobel Prize-winning biochemist. And he was wondering, how come humans started investigating the world around them? And he tried to figure out what is the origin of that conviction. And he came up with this, that the universe is governed by a single God. This is why people started investigating, that the universe is governed by a single God and is not the product of the whims of many gods, each governing his own province according to his own laws. This monotheistic view seems to be the historical foundation for modern science. Okay, so his conclusion is modern science had its beginning because people believed in one God with one set of laws, and they expected to find that. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Del Ratch writes, it's not uncommon for humans to find themselves with the intuition that random, unplanned, unexplained accidents just couldn't produce the order, beauty, and elegance that and seeming purpose that we experience in the natural world around us. So you see what they're saying? The more logical, more reasonable it's more logical and reasonable to look at all the order around us, not only in the vast, in the universe, but in the minute, and conclude there's a creator behind it all. Now, that doesn't prove there is a creator, but it does seem to say it's less logical, at least. It's less reasonable to look at the beauty, the laws, the processes, the systems, and see a random, purposeless, mindless accident. And so when you look at history, you see the great pioneers of modern science, they had God as their inspiration for their science. In fact, over the main entrance, which is what that photo is of the Cavendish Laboratory, the home of the Department of Physics at the University of Cambridge, there's an inscription above the door, and it says, "Great are the works of the Lord, studied by all who delight in them." One more thing, just before we leave this argument, is there's this bafflement that physicists feel. Why can the world be explained mathematically? It just doesn't seem to make sense. And here are some very famous physicists who commented on this. So Eugene Wigner, he's a Nobel laureate. He's an atheist. He committed treason to atheists because he expressed gratitude that mathematics has a link to physics. He said there's no reason they should be connected. Here's what he wrote. The enormous usefulness in mathematics and the natural sciences is something bordering on the mysterious, and there's no rational explanation for it. It is an article of faith. Okay. Sir Roger Penrose, once again, he's an agnostic. He says, it's hard for me to believe that such superb theories could have arisen merely by some random natural selection of ideas. There must be, instead, some deep underlying reason for the accord between mathematics and physics. Listen to those words, mysterious, deep underlying reason. They say it requires faith. But faith in what? Does it require this connection between mathematics and physics and all these laws? Is it a faith in a random mindless accident? Or is it faith in a great mind? I mean, what do? We give Nobel Prizes to people who can not create these things, just define them. How much more praise and glory for the one who invented these things and brought them into creation? So once again, we come back to this simple question. In a world full of discovered and articulated formulas, laws, and patterns, does that point to an intelligent creator who instituted them? Or does it point to a random, mindless, unguided process? Which one requires more faith? Okay, we'll go to step 3 in our journey. The fine-tuning of the universe. And this is the idea. If you've ever done any research into atheism and a belief in an intelligent designer or creator, this is a very popular argument. This is the idea that the fundamental forces that allow us to live, to life on Earth, are amazingly and intricately and delicately balanced, sometimes referred to as on a knife edge, in order to sustain life. They're so precisely fine-tuned that it leads many to conclude that the universe appears to have been designed specifically so that life could be here. Okay? Stephen Hawking, we all have heard of Stephen Hawking. He said the remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers, these finely tuned metrics, the constraints of physics, he said they seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life. When these atheist writers and scientists talk about it, they use things like seem to have been. They're unwilling to admit what science is clearly putting before them. So this merits very serious consideration. Here's a chart. And I know this breaks all the rules of PowerPoint because there's so many small things up there. This is from Jay Richards. It's a list of 22 elements that are finely tuned. And it's not a complete list. I've seen other writers say there's 40, there's 60 fine-tuned. But what I want to look at is just how finely tuned these things are. So just a couple of examples. So theoretical physicist Paul Davies at Arizona State University, he looked at the nuclear strong force to the electromagnetic force. And so, I don't know, these numbers are big. Picture a dial, on a soundboard. But when you turn the dial, there are, what do we have up there? 16 quadrillion, 10 quadrillion little ticks. So you keep on turning it. If it was one to the left, he says no stars would have formed. Or one to the right, no stars would have formed. So it had to be precise. 1 in 10 to the 16, 1 in 10 quadrillion. And just for context, the hardest lottery in the world to win is the Super Eno Lotto. I think it's in Italy. 1 in 622 million. So, I mean, that's a hard thing. This is just one thing that had to be just perfectly tuned. Here's another one. This is the ratio of electromagnetic force constant to gravitational force constant. If increased by 1 part in 10 to the 40, only small stars. If decreased by 1 in 10 to the 40, only big stars. And so astrophysicist Hugh Ross tried to come up with an illustration of how rare, the impossibility of this. And so he said, picture a stack of coins covering the United States, actually covering North America, he said. And that those stacks of coins that cover all of North America are reaching up to the moon. Okay, and one of them is painted red. And then he said, oh yeah, picture a billion other North Americas all covered with stacks of coins, all reaching to the moon. One of them is painted red. Blindfold somebody and ask them to pick out one coin. That's the chance of this type of fine tuning. Like fine tuning isn't a big enough word to describe how rare this is. And it's not just one element. The one author wrote there's 22 of these, all having to be perfect. Other people have said there's 40. That mathematician we've already referred to, eminent mathematician Sir Roger Penrose. And this is hard to comprehend, but when he said, when thinking about the precision required to bring about the universe in just the right way to allow a state of low entropy so that there would be the second law of thermodynamics, he said the chances of that were 1 in 10 to the 123, which is a number so big, if you put a 0 on every particle in the universe, you would run out of particles at around 1 in 10 to the 83. So it's hard to ignore the absolute fine-tuning of all these elements and how everything just seemed to work out so that life could exist. And so scientists who are presented with this say things like this: the impression of design is overwhelming. That was Paul Davies, who's a physicist. When atheist mathematician and astronomer Sir Fred Hoyle learned about the fine-tuning required in the nuclear ground state energy levels in order to allow for an abundant supply of carbon, he confessed that nothing had shaken his atheism as much as this discovery. And he said this: it looked as if a super intellect has monkeyed with physics as well as with chemistry and biology. Is it enough for him to leave his atheism? It should be. Arno Penzias, he said, some people are uncomfortable with the purposefully created world. To come up with things that contradict purpose, they tend to speculate about things they haven't seen. And so, presented with these numbers, with the absolute impossible probability, they've come up with things like the anthropic principle, the anthropic argument, which they say we exist in the universe. We exist, so the universe must have properties for us to exist. Sort of this circular argument. In other words, it's just saying we're here, so let's move on. The other main idea, which is gathering some popularity, is this idea of a multiverse, which states there must be millions and millions of universes, and therefore one of them just would happen to have all those specifically fine-tuned ratios, which Richard Swinburne said, to postulate a trillion other universes rather than one God in order to explain the orderliness of our universe seems the height of irrationality. And I heard another philosopher say, well, if you're going to have a trillion universes, surely one of them will have a God. And so what is more logical to believe? That in a world that requires precisely, and once again, that's not a big enough word, a precisely tuned characteristics and features, that it points to an intelligent creator who instituted them and just fit it perfectly so we could live? Or do these precisely tuned characteristics and features point towards a random, mindless, unguided accident or process? Which one would require more faith? Okay, on to our final stop. And I would suggest the most influential when I started researching and thinking about this. Let's say you were on a walk with your family and you came across this rock. What would you infer? Would you say, wow, that's some random, accidental, mindless, natural process that etched those little symbols into that rock? Or perhaps you would say, I think I see some intelligence in that. It looks like somebody has scratched in a couple of symbols. And then maybe you would begin to say, who did that? And what do they mean? And why would they scratch those symbols on a rock? Is this money? Is this a way of communicating? And if you thought it was a random, mindless thing, would you pick it up and just throw it? Well, there's no reason to investigate it. It's just a natural process. What about this? Have you heard of SETI, S-E-T-I? It's the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And they were asked, what is your criteria? So they've got these satellites and microphones, and they're listening for something in outer space. They're searching for extraterrestrial, for intelligence outside of our solar system. And they state they're looking for and listening for laser flashes and techno signatures. They're listening for a pattern. Basically, they're listening for a pattern of sound or of sight. In fact, July 13th of this year, there was a clear and periodic pattern of fast radio bursts. And so, they get interested, they get excited. And this is regarded in the legitimate scope of scientific inquiry. Okay? They're given millions of dollars each year. Carl Sagan said it would take one single message to convince us that there's intelligence in the universe. One single message. What about this? These 4 letters, exit. Do you infer intelligence behind these 4 letters? Of course you do. There are 4 letters. They're sequenced in a certain way to convey an important message. The little arrow as well, that if something bad happens in here, this is the way to get out. So think about this. Some scratches in a rock, looks like intelligence. Pulses, one message, pulses or light pattern, intelligence. 4 letters sequenced in a row to bring about a message. We infer intelligence, don't we? What about this? DNA, 3.2, and that's the low estimate. Some are 3.5 billion. 3.2 billion letters long, sequenced perfectly so that life may exist. The information content of DNA is fundamental to life. It's not living itself, it's just a set of instructions. And they're needed for and used by the cell to build functional proteins out of amino acids. There are 3.2 billion letters that make up the human genome. E. coli has about 4 million letters in a row, which would be about 1,000 pages in a book. So 1,000 pages of perfectly sequenced letters, information, so that E. coli can reproduce and build itself. Humans, the human genome, 3.2 billion, which is like a whole library of information. Do we see intelligence there? Scratches in a rock, intelligence. Blips from space, the assumption of intelligence. 4 letters and an exit sign, we say it's intelligence. 3.2 billion perfectly sequenced letters in a row for the human genome. The instructions for life, intelligence, or a random purposeless accident. Like, come on. Where did this information come from? It's even called the genetic code. All scientists happily talk about the living cell as an information processing machine. Bill Gates said this is very similar to software code, only much, much, much more sophisticated than anything humans have ever produced. And people might argue whether Windows is intelligently designed or not, but and it's not just the sheer quantity of intelligible information. It's the way it's transcribed that just boggles the mind. The two that discovered the double helix, Francis Crick and James Watson, they're both devoted atheists, and they discovered this. And here's what Francis Crick said: the origin of life seems almost to be a miracle. So many are the conditions which would have had to have been satisfied to get it going. James Watson, his partner, was questioned on this, like, how do you get 3.2 billion letters? And he said it happened and refused to talk about it any further. I think Dawkins would call that lazy science. So you have this sophisticated, intricate set of instructions that had to have come from somewhere. But it's just information. They're the building plans. Now they go to the factory floor. And what happens in the factory floor is just as amazing, perhaps even more magnificent. It's how these plans, this information, gets turned into life. So what we're going to watch, hopefully this is going to work, we're going to watch a little video, and scientists are beginning to see what's going on inside the cell. If you remember in grade 11 science, you'd have a picture of a cell, and it just seemed sort of static. There was the nucleus, and there was some little weird shapes here and there, but it didn't seem to be doing much. They're beginning to understand what's going on inside the cell, and they're creating these reproductions of what's going on. And so we're just going to look at the process.
What you are about to see is DNA's most extraordinary secret: how a simple code is turned into flesh and blood. It begins with a bundle of factors assembling at the start of a gene. A gene is simply a length of DNA instructions stretching away to the left. The assembled factors trigger the first phase of the process, reading off the information that will be needed to make the protein. Everything is ready to roll. 3, 2, 1, go. The blue molecule racing along the DNA is reading the gene. It's unzipping the double helix and copying one of the 2 strands. The yellow chain snaking out of the top is a copy of the genetic message, and it's made of a close chemical cousin of DNA called RNA. The building blocks to make the RNA enter through an intake hole. They are matched to the DNA, letter by letter, to copy the A's, C's, T's, and G's of the gene. The only difference is that in the RNA copy, the letter T is replaced with a closely related building block known as U. You are watching this process called transcription in real time. It's happening right now in almost every cell in your body.
And so when these types of, and there's more, if you want to check them out, they show what's going on inside your cell with the kinesin, and it's just fabulous to watch this, not just this factory, it's like this little city that's going on in each of your cells. And as each cell separates, the process that's going on, extreme levels of intelligence to bring this about. Dawkins, when he saw animations like this, it said it knocked him sideways. He said animations like this, especially part 2, which you can go on your own time to watch, and I would encourage you to do so, knocked me sideways with wonder at listen to the words he's using, miniatured intricacy of the data processing machinery in the living cell, and with admiration for the science that has worked it all out. And then the mRNA then travels to the cytoplasm where it is translated. So it takes all that information. It still has to make something with it. So the ribosome moves along the mRNA strand, reading the sets of chemicals called the codon, and it tells what amino acids to grab. It grabs those amino acids, adds it to others to develop a protein. And this is the chart humans have developed to figure out what it's doing. Now ask yourself, does this look like some random, mindless, unguided process? Or does it look like there is some sort of intelligence behind this? So it takes the 3 letters and then it just figures out what amino acids it needs. You see those at the bottom. So this is what Oxford mathematician John Lennox says. He says, the very nature of the complexity of organisms, the nature and extreme sophistication of their protein machinery, the coding they contain, their capacity to use programmed information, etc., is piling up evidence that there is a mind behind life. Now, we have to be fair to Charles Darwin. He did not have the technology we have nowadays. He thought cells were just a little bit of goof. But as they discover these things, you can see why scientists are beginning to say we need to redefine things. When investigating this complexity, evolutionary biologists Maynard Smith and Zathmary, which we've referred to earlier, had this to confess. The existing translational machinery is at the same time so complex, so universal, and so essential that it is hard to see how it could have come into existence or how life could have existed without it. So you see what they're saying there? They're saying you need that little machine to do all that work and take all that information at the outset of life. Without it, how do you have life? And so they're saying it's hard to understand how that happened, right? You can't have life without that little translational. How did that complex, sophisticated machine? And it's not just that. There are other systems in the cell, and they all rely on one another. How did it come about randomly, accidentally, without purpose? And not only, ready and set to go right from the beginning. So Stephen Meyer, he's a philosopher of science. He said, DNA does not imply the need for an intelligent designer because it has some similarities to a software program or to a human language. It implies the need for an intelligent designer because it possesses an identical feature, namely information content, that intelligently designed human texts and computer languages possess. So we're not working by analogy here. They're not saying DNA is kind of like, it's sort of like. He's saying it is information like a human language, and that requires a mind. Another one, Hubert Yockey, physicist. It's important to understand that we are not reasoning by analogy. The sequence hypothesis that the genetic code works essentially like a book applies directly to protein and genetic text, as well to written language, and therefore is mathematically identical. Okay, so he's basically saying it's not like a book, it is a book. Francis Collins, he was the director of the Human Genome Project. He said, it's humbling for me and awe-inspiring to realize that we have caught the first glimpse of our own instruction book, previously known only to God. So I'll ask one more time, is it more logical to believe that a world where living things require complex language-based systems and sophisticated machinery to read the information, to process it, and to execute the instructions points to an intelligent designer, a creator who instituted them? Or do those complex language-based systems and sophisticated machinery that read, process, and execute the instructions, do they point to a random, mindless, unguided process? Which one requires more faith? Alan Sandage, an American astronomer, said, the world is too complicated in all its parts and interconnections to be due to chance alone. I am convinced that the existence of life with all its order and each of its organisms is simply too well put together. And so that's we're coming to the end of our journey. So when I look at the world, and I know many people do, they see an intelligent creator who engineered a world with incredible complexity and diversity, far beyond what human intelligence can create. I see it. I don't know what that is. Okay, so I see an intelligent creator who engineered the world with incredible complexity and diversity. I see an intelligent creator, an intelligent God who put into place laws and principles so that this world can be studied and the things in it. I see an intelligence that had the fine-tuning and the foresight to know what we needed to exist in this world. And I see an intelligent creator that put in place the sophisticated information necessary for life in every living cell, in the molecular machines to read, transcribe, and interpret those plans. And I'll be honest, I do not see any way all of those things could have come about by a random, unguided, mindless process. It just doesn't fit. I'd have to say I don't have that much faith. So we have to wrap up, but I have one question for those online and those here. If you are an atheist, and you're trying to convince people to join your understanding of the world, what is the motivation for you? What is the motivation for others to become atheist? Dawkins said this. He said, the universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. Is that what you're calling me to? A world that has no good, no evil, pitiless indifference, no meaning to life. Think about the consequences of a world that claims that there is no good and no evil. When you watch the news next time, tell yourself there's nothing good, there's nothing evil. See if that's a convincing argument. But I'll tell you what the reason for having a faith, to believe that there's an intelligence behind this, that there's a God behind these things. And if you found any of these arguments at all stirring something inside of you, please hear me. In our Bible, which we believe is written by the creative mind behind all this world, behind the God that says faith is a good thing, that it's a tremendous quality, there's a whole chapter in that Bible that talks about those who lived by faith. And in it is this verse. It says, "By faith we understand that the universe was created by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible." Part of that faith is believing that God is behind everything. And our Creator says, you do have a meaning. There is such a thing as good and evil. You are not an accident. You are not pitiless. You are made in his image, and there is a hope. And he's reached out to us. And so I encourage you, if you've come to some of these, continue to look into the Bible, continue to investigate these things, search them out, because there is a purpose. And our God has invited us to that purpose. And we find it in our Bibles. Find out what God has in store for those who believe that he exists. Because we're told that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him.
Thank you for joining us. We hope you found the episode helpful. Don't forget, most of these episodes are also available as videos on our video channel, cdvideo.org. So head over and take a look. If you have any comments or questions or suggestions, please get in touch or leave us a voice message. We love to hear your feedback. You can email us at btf@cdvideo.org. If you enjoyed the episode, then please share it with others. Until next time, may God bless you in your studies and your walk towards God's kingdom. Amen.